Hello, welcome to the course here. This is Christian. In this video, I'm going to talk about classes in Python. Now, so before we do that, I'm going to go and do a setup here first. I'm going to go into the File Explorer. We're now in Unit 10. I'm just going to open that folder and create a new file. And I'm just going to call it objects and classes.py. It's a long file, but that's okay. I'm going to close the untitled one here. Okay, so in here, my variable explorer is up here, and then my console is right here. Okay, I want to just do one setup first because I don't want to reset my variables every time. So notice that when you run your program, if I type like A is 12, it stays in the cache here, right? So even when I run my code over here, there's nothing run. As you can see, A still stays here until I clear my cache. You have to do that manually every time. And sometimes that can cause some trouble because when you run the code, it retains some default data in memory, and your error will not be caught because some data still exists in RAM. So I'm going to remove that every time when I run the program. Okay, to do that, you just go to the setting, and you have a wrench here. If you don't have the wrench, you could go to the tools and preferences, same thing. Take you to this preferences here. So in the general, just make sure again you have a few things you can modify. The font size, right now I'm setting to 18 both in the coding and the console here as well, so you can kind of see how big they are. If you go here, you could check some of the stuff here in the run. Okay, it says right here in the general settings, there it says remove all variables before execution. So I want to check that box. So every time when I run, it will clear my cache every time. And so that's good. Editor, also you want to make sure you click on this wrap lines checkbox so that your editor screen won't have to scroll left and right. So just check that, and your line will auto wrap. I think that's pretty much it. So let's see. All right, so go ahead and click apply or click OK. And now when I run like a something like that in the cache here, but when I execute my program, it wipes that from memory. Okay, so that's a pretty good setting. Okay, so let's talk about classes. Classes in Python are really just a template, okay, or templates, also known as blueprints, right? The blueprints of, is it one word, two word? I don't know. It's a blueprint. Yeah, it's a blueprint of an object. Okay, you need to do that in order to create object. So objects cannot exist without a class in the programming world. So that means you have to design that template first. So classes in Python, you would just create that by issuing the class command, followed by a space or more, a name of your class. So for example, student is a class. And by convention, all class names or identifiers should be using the capitalized mode, or we call this the Pascal case, right? So you capitalize every word. So if I have like student, info, data, for example, I have 3 words, so every word should be capitalized. And this is just a convention. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't work. It's just easier to see that way when you write in your code. We see a keyword or a class name that has the capital S, or a capital letter, you know that that is a class. So and then followed by a colon, and then the syntax looks very similar, right? Indentation is important. Inside the class here, then you can then create variables. We call those data fields or static data fields, methods, and so on. Now, Python classes and all this data, there are no privacy. You don't have privacy here. So that means you cannot set a field or a class or a function or anything into private like you would with like Java or C# or things like that. Okay, so everything is exposable, is visible pretty much. And so we just have to go to believe that once I declare a variable or a function using a special syntax, we know that that's a private variable and we should not use it. Okay, it doesn't mean you cannot use it. You can, just we should not. That's the key. All right, so inside here, then again, this is the every field, anything you create here, any variable here, all these will be called static data. Okay, inside here, for example, if I create a string of name is equal to something like that, or if you put Jill, okay, this is a static field. It is, it does belong to the class called student, but doing this way is very different from you would do in Java, where that field can be set to private or public, right? So it's a little bit different. So that these are called data fields, static fields, and I'll go over what that means. So usually these are not very common. You can still have them, but they're not common. And there is one subtle difference between it, because changing one of these data field can actually affect your object sometimes. So it's not very common to do this. If you use something like this, if you want to use it just for like, I guess, the local calculations or things like that. Okay, so these are static fields, and so I'm not going to do that now. I'll just put a note here so you can see what that is. So every class has a constructor. In Python, there's only one constructor. You cannot have multiple constructors, very much like PHP, or I guess most of the dynamically typed languages, because data are, dynamically typed. Therefore, it's really hard to emulate this method overloading technique or feature in object and in polymorphism. So usually you have just one constructor. Okay. So the constructor, this is the constructor. A constructor is just a special function to create object. Okay. And every class has it. If you don't use one, Python will create one automatically behind the scene. Okay, but usually you want to create your own, so you have control of your data. So in here, the definition for a constructor is always the same. You cannot change this. It's followed by the define or def keyword, 2 underscores, the word init. It's case sensitive, so make sure it's underscore init, lowercase, and then two more trailing underscores, followed by the parentheses and the colon. Inside this parentheses, you must put a variable in here. Now, Python commonly uses the word self. Okay, it's been referenced everywhere. In every documentation you read, you will see the word self in there. It just happened to be that way. It doesn't mean that it has to be self. It can be anything you want to call it. It doesn't matter. I can call it me. I can call it this. It doesn't matter. It's the first variable. The first variable must be the variable that points to the object. Okay, so it's just so common, so we use the word self instead. And then inside the constructor, then you can now create data fields. Okay, so there's data fields, and because they're not, again, back to the privacy thing, right? You cannot set private data fields here. So usually anything that is private or attached to an object, you would do it inside here through this self object. Okay, in this case, it is an object. So if you want the name to be associated with a student in any data fields, you will initialize it in here. So it would say self dot and then name, right? So the name is a property or attribute of this class. And I could set to a default name. Everybody will have Jill. If you don't like that, you can say default to just empty string. Or you can call it none. Okay, nothing is assigned, but at least you created that property. So because again, just naming convention, and we want to treat the name field as a private field. So usually you will see that it's kind of common to put an underscore, one underscore in front of these fields. So we know that when we see that field, it's a private field. It's also common in like JavaScript as well, or some languages. You see that in the code, if you want to set a data to private, you put the underscore in front like that. Okay, so when you see that, it's a private field. It doesn't mean it should be private. It's just a notation to tell us that that's a private field. Okay. Okay, so make sure just one underscore. If you happen to put two underscores, okay, Python treats that a little bit different, well, actually very differently than a single score. So make sure you use only one underscore for your fields. And let's see if I can show you how this works if you happen to use two underscores. It behaves very differently. So we have a field called name now it's attached to the object itself. Any additional field, you can set it in here. It doesn't mean that everything you set in this function will only retain those. I mean, it doesn't mean you cannot add additional fields to it. You can, as long as you add inside this function here. It doesn't matter where you add them. Usually inside another function. Then that once you invoke that function, and if that field becomes active, then now it's part of that object. Okay, so for example, if I have self name is a name, I have another field, maybe like self ID would be, we'll give like none ID as well, and we'll have another one here, or I just have those two, okay? And I have another field down here, another function. I have a function, we'll call it maybe, what should we call it? Well, before I proceed further, now, when we initialize or we call this student class, it's going to initialize this two fields to none. That's the default. And so what you need to do also is how do you get those data back, or how do you modify them, or how do you mutate or change those data? And we have those two special terms called mutators and accessors, or sometimes it's called getters and setters. Okay, so I put here setters, also known as, because we were setting data, mutators. These are functions, okay? And then we have another group down here called getters, just the opposite, also known as accessors, because we're accessing data, accessing these data back. Okay, so these are just functions, and you have a function called to set. So usually you call it set something, set by the name of the field, set the name. Okay, and because you're setting the name, that means that I'm going to pass some data to it. So this function should receive something like you receive a name string, right? And then once you receive that name, you can set it to the self.name underscore name equals to this name that is passed to this function. That's how you set the name. Okay, but again, notice I didn't put the self, so it has an underscore. Squiggly line tells you if you put your mouse over here, it says undefined self. Okay, you must have, again, the word self in here as the first parameter. It's required because all these functions are not static functions. Okay, these are dynamic functions that are part of the object. And so all your function in this scenario must have this self in it. So let's do another one, the def set ID. Again, self.id, and then self underscore ID is equal to the ID that's passed to it. All right. Okay, so that is those are the setters. Now the getters are kind of same, except now you're returning data back. So you're not receiving any data. It doesn't mean you can't. You just return the data. So the simplest types are just basically, again, get name. I pass in the self, and I'm not passing any data to it. The self is by default included. When you call it, you don't have to pass self to it. It just included, right? And then I'm just return the self dot underscore name, and that's it. That's a getter. I do the other one as well. Get ID self, and then return self underscore ID. So I have my setters and my getters for two fields. Okay. And then now I'm going to go and use this. Okay, so to use it, you will just create down here a variable of that class. And so you can say this is how you instantiate. I'll put here instantiate an object. Okay, so you do that by doing as follows. So I have a student, call it, we'll just call it student1 equal, and then the student class, capital S, which is why when you see that capital S, you know that this is a class. Okay, that means I'm creating or instantiating an object of type student called student1. This is not the name of the student. It's just an object type. The actual name refers to the self.name, the properties of that student, right? So like this is an object like you and me. You are a person, I'm a person. What's your name? Well, that's my property. Okay. So then now I can then set my data field after I created a student1. I could just now say student1 dot, use the dot notation. You see you have access to the get ID, get name, and set ID, set names. If you scroll up and scroll down, you see also the private data fields, underscore ID, underscore name. You have access to those too. Even the init function here, right? So everything is visible in Python. Okay, you just have to follow a certain rule that you shouldn't do that. So when you work for a company, you would want to do something like that. Okay. All right. So I'm going to say set set ID. I'm going to pass in the ID of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for this student here. I also want to do, student1 dot set name. We'll pass in the name of Jill, and then that's it. If I want to print it out, then I would do a print name is, and then we'll pass in the student1 dot get name function, and I'll do another one, print. I'll show you a different way to print your function. Notice I'm using the comma here to separate each field. I could use the Python 4 point, I forgot which version it was, but it's a different way to format code. You just put the F in front for format, followed by a pair of square brackets, quotes, single, double, doesn't matter. And you put here ID, and then you put a curly braces here. Inside here is you put the actual data fields. Data, right? Variable name or expression. I'm going to put student1 dot get ID. Okay, that's another way to do it, and there are a couple of ways to do it. So if I save that now and go ahead and run my script, and here you go, you see that Jill is the name and the student ID is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and if I type in student over here, student1, it tells me that this is an object because it has these things in there, right? You don't see the actual data. So if I print instead of that one, okay, it was the same thing. It says it's an object. Okay, so object, you cannot display its data here unless you call the actual fields in here. Okay, so now you can see how I can access those two data fields. I set them using their function, and then get the data using their function as well. Okay, very common in object-oriented programming. So we have two fields. Now I'm going to add another function here. This has nothing to do with getters or setters. It's just a utility function or a function to calculate something, maybe like GPA calculation, for example, or something like that, right? Or calculate average score or whatever it is. So these are, I just call this like utility functions or methods. Okay, I can call one called call it just a calc grades or average grade. Okay, I'm gonna pass in maybe like 3 or 4 scores. So put grade A, B, C. So 3 grades and get the average on those grades. Okay, and then I will create in here. Again, you want to put the word self in front. Don't forget that. And I'm gonna say a local variable in here. We'll just call it avg is equal to a plus b plus c, and then divided by 3. All right, that's my average. And then I will then say self dot underscore avg grade equals avg. Now I created a new field called avg grade. Okay, I did not include it in the one I instantiated, but once I create the average grade, that exists. And let me go ahead and save this. Now I'm just going to run it like I did now, and let me clear my console over here. And so I run it, and here we go, the name and things that over here. I'm going to access the grade, so I can say student 1 dot, if I access the actual data, like name, right? You see that it's Jill. If I do it again, if I get the ID, I get 1, 2, 3. And if I try to grab the AVG grade, okay, you see that it doesn't exist. It does not exist because I haven't invoked this function yet. So now, while still active here, I did not clear my cache yet. I'm going to go ahead and then invoke that function calculate average grade. So I could do student1 dot calculate avg grade. I'm going to pass in 3 grades. I'll just say 90, 99, and 80. Okay. So now that has been created. I can now go back and invoke that average grade again. So student1 dot underscore avg grade. Okay. You see that now it's part of this student because once I invoked it, that becomes a new property added to the student. Because this is a dynamic type language, this is allowed. Otherwise, this will not work in Java. Okay, in Java, you have to, create all the fields you need, and then once you create it, that's all you're gonna get. Okay. But in Python and JavaScript and PHP, you can create new ones. You can destroy them as you go as well. It's because these are created dynamically. So, they have their own, pros and cons. So at this point, once I invoke that, then I have those 3 attributes attached to self. Okay, so, and then once I clear my cache, it's all gone again. But now, so that you can see that I can create new fields in separate functions or anywhere in the code here. Okay. And this is just a function to process some internal data. And if I want to get the grade out of this, well, you would use a getter, right? So you don't have to supply the setter. Let's say you cannot set average grade. The only way to set it if you call this function. But to get it back, I can go down here and then run another function. Let's say get avg grade. And then I would then do a return self underscore avg grade. So now it's more efficient. So I don't call my variables directly like this because, again, the private properties, right? It's supposed to be private. All right, so I have so all these functions, as you can see, including the constructor, you must use the word self in there as a first parameter. Again, it doesn't have to be self. It could be anything you want. It doesn't mean once you call self, everywhere else has to be self. It doesn't have to be. I can change this to just say me. And as long as you use, you know, consistently in your code, that's fine. I can use me here. This one could be this. It's very common in the, Java and JavaScript. This, like that, right? If I save that and run it again, you see that it's no problem. It still works just fine because all this is just a pointer, right? It's an object that points to this class when you instantiate that object. So whatever you call here, it doesn't really matter. But just again, by convention that we use this as the self. Okay. So that is the getters and setters and your functions and so on. Now, when you write a function without the self in it, without the first parameter, let's just say that I have another function up here. I'll call it function, maybe I'll just call it say hi. Okay, notice I did not put any variables in there. I just want to print the message hi. So just say print hi, right? You just want that. And you want to invoke it by saying student1 dot say hi. If I save that and I run this code, you see that it has no error. If I go here and say student1 dot say hi, okay, now you have an error. Okay, you can't call it. It says it needs one argument, was not given. So it's expecting this self in here. So you cannot call this function this way. And because these are not, these are not static functions. These are dynamic functions, like or they call it like if you remember, if you have taken Java, this is like a non-static. So in Java, you put the word static in front to make it static, so you can call it, right? But it's different in Python. So that means I still have to put the word self in here, even though I don't use self in this function at all. I just print the message, okay, like that. I still need to put the self in there. And now if I run it again, and now if I do say student1 dot say hi, and now it's okay, right? But what if you don't want to use it, right? So this is where you can declare static data, and that's the same as staying up here, static fields, static methods as well. And I don't think this is in the book, but I want to show you anyway. Okay, so if I don't want to use it, I want to use a static function, then you have to you have to decorate this function with a special decorator called static method. You follow that, prefix that with the @ symbol, and you type in the word static method. That's all it takes, right? So now this is a static method. It does not have the self, so it does not belong to the self, I guess, to the student. It does have it. You can call it, you can use it, but now it's not really a property of that student. It sort of is, but it just means it's shared across all other objects as well, because it's static. So now if I run this again now, and then if I go ahead and type in student1 dot say hi, okay, you see that now it's accessible. Because it's static, I forgot to mention, if it's not static, you cannot call these directly if you don't call it through an object. You can call these from the student class without creating an object. What I mean is this. So student1 is an object we created down here. That's why I can use it. I can call, for example, I can just say student, the class name, followed by the name dot, and if I say get ID, okay, you'll see that it says you cannot call it because it requires a self argument. That means it needs to be an object. Because I just called the class directly, you cannot call it. However, because hey hi is a static method, it doesn't need the self in there, right? So if anything that doesn't have the self in it, you can call directly using the class name. And because again, it's shared by everybody. So I can say student dot say hi. And you can see I can print that message out, right? So that is the distinction between a static function or method versus a non-static function with a self in it. Okay, with static, I can call directly through the class name or through the object name. Either way. Okay, if it's a non-static field like these or functions, you can only access these through the object. You cannot call them directly through the class. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Fields also same. Up here is also same. If you have a variable name, you cannot call it, if it's a variable name outside of your class without a self attached to it, you can access it through the student class or the other one. So for example, if I change this to say, maybe we'll change this to say something like a school equals, and would say GTC, right? But save that, I run it again. My student object underscore school, you can see I can access that school variable. I can also access directly through the class because it's a static field. Now look what happens. Okay, they're both GTC. I'm going to say student, I'm called the class name dot school. I'm going to change it to a different variable. I'm going to say, let's just say gateway. Okay, I changed the name. Now if I access it again, student.school, it now says gateway. If I access this through the student object, student1.school, it also changed, right? Because it's static data. So now it affects every other object that are associated with this student. Okay. However, it is very tricky in Python, which is not recommended doing this way. However, until I use that field in my student1 object, if I change that, then at that point you lost that static, I guess the link there. Now it becomes a property of the student object. So if I go in here, for example, if I change student1 school back to say GTC. Okay, so now school is now a property of the student object. And if I type in student1 school, it gets me GTC. If I type the student class school, it should still say gateway, right? So now they're completely independent now. And at this point, if I make changes through either way, it's not going to affect the student object anymore. So if I say student.school equals, I'm just going to say, I don't know, let's call it Harvard. Okay, and if I try to access through the student1 object, it still says GTC. Okay, so that's why it's kind of tricky in Python when you have data fields in the space out here, because these are treated as static data until the object changed its data. Then at that point it becomes a instance field for that object. If you don't change it, then it's a static field. So if you change it through the class, then it's going to change that field. If you have another variable, another object, and you change the data, then that only belongs to that object, and it should not affect the other object. They're still independent. Okay, so I gave you a little bit much more than you needed, but at least I want to throw that out there so you're not confused if you have background in other languages such as Java and how that really differs from Python. Okay. All right. So I have a school static field out here, and if you want to use these fields inside your function, it's also very tricky. Okay, so if I want to say hi, I'm going to write another function here. I can say a print a school. I'll pass itself. to it. So it's a part of the object. And I want to print the school name, right? And then I could use, if I try to hit the school variable here like that, you think that this is in global space, right? Because it's in the class, it's a global space. But once you see, once you type it in here, it does highlight it, and you have a little arrow, a little warning icon in the back here. It says this undefined name, and you wonder why. It's global, but why is it not here? Okay, and when you save this, and if I run it again, if I go ahead and type student1.print school, okay, you see that it has an error. It's a school name variable field is not defined, and there it is. Okay, so it's very tricky as well, because this is a static field. To use this inside your functions, you have to go through the class name. You can't just put it here. So that means you have to go student dot school, which is why it's not really useful to put data fields outside here. So inside all your functions, internal functions in here, you have to reference it using the student dot school, whatever fields you have up here. Okay. What about if you want to call the functions print hi? Like I print the name, I want to invoke the function say hi. Right? Again, same rule. If you say here says undefined name, say hi. Because this is a static data, you have to invoke it through the class name. So just to show you, save that, run again. If I print over here, if I go to student1.print school, and the same error. Say hi is not defined, but there it is. Because it's static, you have to use student.say hi inside a function. So now it should work. Student1.print school, and there it is. Okay, so these are some of the differences between Python and JavaScript. Even JavaScript is different, and Java and many other languages. Okay, so just be careful when you use static data, either a function or a field like this. Okay, so I'll stop here, and in the next video, we'll delve a little bit deeper into classes and objects and how we can use them to create more complex programs.